Hello, welcome to Bogan Intel. Today's guest is Wendy Bacon, veteran investigative journalist who has spent decades exposing corruption, championing free speech, and amplifying marginalized voices. Wendy's recent work dives into the weaponization of anti-Semitism, censorship in healthcare, and dark money in the 2025 election. So stay with us for a riveting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Wendy Bacon.
Good to be here, Joe.
Now, we've been chatting a little bit of late, and it's been great to hook up with you as one independent journalist to another. Thanks again for just being on the program and maybe helping the audience on a couple of topics that you've been writing about recently. Got a couple of big articles that you've put out over the last few months. One of them around the Combat Antisemitism Movement's summit in the Gold Coast. And you recently wrote about, the
Yeah,
aftermath of
sure.
that. And I was just wondering
Yeah.
if you could provide just a little bit of information essentially about that story and what's going on there.
Well, I think, first of all, the Combat Antisemitism Summit that happened in the first few days of September is part of a global movement. And I think it's really important to see it like that and to see that, in fact, the key figures running it, including the summit in Australia, are in Israel. A lot of the funding comes from the US, and there is a lot of organization in the US, and they have things all around the world. The same week they're doing something in Australia, they'll be doing something in Colombia, in South America. And the summit in Australia was to get together. The idea of it was as many mayors and councillors from around Australia to try to implant Gillian Siegel. She's the special envoy for anti-Semitism. The idea was to try to implant the definition, the IHRA definition, I think people will know of that, of anti-Semitism, and a program to put it into place in local communities. Now, their view is that if we can get it in place in local communities, we can then move more at the state and federal level. I'm not sure how well that will work for them in Australia because councils in Australia don't have the same powers as they do in the United States, where they might be running schools and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, that was their plan. And that plan was initiated last December at the end of 2024. So our stories covered who was involved, both internationally, who was involved at the Australian end, how they had recruited people, and then the conference took place. So, of course, now the question is how successful will they be? The proof is in the pudding, if you like how, from their point of view, this extreme Zionist organization run from Israel, how successful will they be in getting the ARA definition, the Gillian Siegel plan, implemented at the local government area in Australia? So that's, not just me, there's activists covering this as well. And I might mention just there that, we did a story about there was a booklet distributed at the summit, which was eventually attended, I think, by about 150 people, a booklet called The Symbols of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. That booklet, which I just wanted to mention that we would not have got that if there hadn't been activists outside the summit who went in and got their sort of show bag, their conference show bag, and brought it out. And in that was this booklet about the symbols. Now, the symbols include, I mean, it's extraordinary things like watermelons, the slogan Free Palestine, obviously things that are genuinely anti Semitic as well, but also from the river to the sea, slogans that are clearly associated with the pro-Palestinian and rights to self-determination for Palestinian people, that they brand anti-Semitism. But the other document was just as important. It was the action plan. And I thought one of the most notable points, if you like, in this action plan was that councils would set up committees onto which people would be invited. Jewish, read Zionists there. I'm sure they won't be inviting any of the Jewish pro-Palestinian activists. Police, and members of the community security group, that protects synagogues, but also is more deeply embedded in security work than that. And they will be on these committees to identify acts of anti-Semitism by their definition. And that's where it becomes very worrying, I think, that if they successfully get motions through councils, well, then we could see, certainly it's against any sense of democratic rights to protest or free expression.
We couldn't be seeing groups like CSG doing jobs out the front of our town hall anytime soon, could we, Wendy?
Oh, I think we could. I definitely think we could. I mean, whether our town halls, I don't know where you are, Joel. I'm in the city of Sydney, in Sydney, and there Clover Moore did not, she's the Lord Mayor of Sydney, did not go um, to the summit. And the Deputy Mayor did, however, but I cannot imagine them moving on a motion. However, just next week, I hear, in fact, Woollahra Council will try to implement the anti-Semitism plan that has already been implemented in Waverley. And just for people who are not in New South Wales, essentially, Sydney is on the eastern fringe of the CBD is on the eastern fringe of Sydney, and then we've got the area to the east, and that's the most conservative area now of Sydney. Well, I mean, there's a teal there actually, but anyway, in terms of councils, the Zionists are very deeply entrenched, and they have already got this plan implemented in Waverley, and so it's adjacent. Uh, LGA is going to move next week. Now, I don't know how that will go, but I just mentioned in Melbourne, Glen Ira already had the IRA definition in place, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's like Caulfield, Murrumbeena, suburbs like that. But last week, Bayside, Victoria, because there's two Baysides, one in Sydney and one in Victoria, Bayside unanimously passed the program, if you like, the IRA definition. They didn't pass the actual action plan, but it was, I found a very disturbing debate. Maybe we might come back to that later.
Well, I mean, the IRA definition is essentially the action plan in some form or the other. Look, I was speaking with a sitting councillor who, was expressing, speaking to the issue with the executive trying to sort of drum through the IRA definition, but now with the councillors as well on the other side. It's kind of a bit of a worrying sort of instance, and we're seeing things like Bayside moving very quickly. I mean, there are councils hitting the ground running here, and I wonder what the incentive.
I think they would have. Yeah, I think the people who went to the summit were really whipped up by like lots of international speakers and others, that their job was to go back and implement it. Now, actually, I think we have to keep it in proportion, because there's hundreds of councils in Australia, and at very most 70 of them were represented. I think it's actually less than that. There are people trying to track it carefully, but I would say it's less than that. And I think what they're actually doing at the moment, Joel, is, if you like, picking off the low-hanging fruit, trying to get some solid blocks where it's in place. And then, of course, there's the ongoing political situation. There'll be future elections, that sort of thing. I think they'd have a little bit of a long-range plan, but I certainly think right now they're trying to take the rest of the Conservative councils. And I think it's important to keep a watch on the City of Melbourne, because two councillors went from the City of Melbourne, including the Deputy Mayor of the City of Melbourne, who's called Rashina Campbell. Now, she is I don't like saying women, are like their husbands, but nevertheless, it is significant that her partner is James Campbell, who's a senior editor at the News Corp, and so very much a warrior there for the right. And she actually is very, I think, eloquent in many ways in the way she speaks. But what she's really pushing for is tougher protest laws in Victoria. Now, that I wouldn't count on the Victorian government not being prepared to cooperate there. It's always been different in Victoria because in New South Wales, for many decades now, we've always had to apply. Well, we haven't had to apply, but people got into the way of applying for permits to protest so you can walk down the road. That hasn't been the case in Melbourne. And I think it will be a significant setback, saying she'll be moving on that and ramping up her efforts to both at a local government level and a state level to push back on protest. And one of the things that she's already managed to get at the City of Melbourne is very rapid removal of graffiti and postering and that sort of thing, removing the messages as quickly as possible.
Yep.
And I mean, that interesting enough, that took me back to I was in fascist Spain just before Franco, the fascist dictator of Spain, um, died. Did he die or was he deposed? But no, I think he died actually. But anyway, it was in those latter days of fascist Spain, and every night in Barcelona, um, graffiti will go up on the walls and every day it'd be removed. And I sort of thought, well, maybe City of Melbourne is moving in that direction. So I think people need to keep a close eye on the City of Melbourne.
So, in your recent article, you've highlighted CEO Sasha Reutman, CAM CEO Sasha Reutman's Jerusalem Post piece, and labeling the critics of the actual conference as anti-Semitic themselves. And you've mentioned some of, the definitions of anti-Semitism that were crammed into this booklet. Some of them including, sections of watermelon, which, can be argued from the ground that there's some trouble there. But what are you seeing here around the weaponization of anti-Semitism more broadly? And, how is this being used to shape public discourse more ultimately around Israel-Palestine in the media, but also mostly around, the population? And what does it mean for free speech ultimately?
I think it means a lot for free speech ultimately if and only if, one, we comply, because I've always, right, going back a long, long time, always believed with free speech, you
Mm.
have to exercise your right to free speech and resist. If people try to censor you, you have to, in practice, push back. And I'll use, for an example, one of the things you constantly hear the pro-Israel lobby repeating is that from the river to the sea is itself anti-Semitic. Now, as we know, people who've been chanting that slogan for a long time, it is actually something in support of equal rights for all people from the river to the sea. It's a one-state solution thing. But they have now said that somehow this from the river to the sea actually implies the extermination of all Jewish people in that area, which is just like so bizarre and so far from what anyone has intended. But the more they are able to say that, and the more it goes out there, I mean, it goes out through the right-wing media, we know that without any challenge at all, but the more it's not challenged in let's say the more mainstream, not progressive but middle of the road media, the more it's not challenged there, or the more they're just repeating it in public forums, the more it's this that misunderstanding grows. I might just go back to the Bayside debate the other night and only yesterday, and people should follow these things because there is a webcast. If you need to go to Bayside webcast, I might just say it's about minute 26 because finding it can be a bit tricky. But there you can actually watch, and I think it's important that people do that, watch the debate. It's not very long. The mayor didn't turn up at all. There were about 5 or 6 people, and they voted unanimously to impose this IRA definition. But continually, they misled the public. They misled everyone who was there and the broader ratepayers or people living in that area. They kept distorting the IRA definition. They actually made it out that the IRA definition is only about local anti-Semitism. It's got nothing to do with Israel, and it's got nothing to do with international politics. Well, as we know, it's got everything to do with Israel and international politics. So that is, first of all, a lie. And very misleading, but this is how slippery things can get. And so just going back to Sasha Reutman, and I might just say he is the CEO of the Combat Antisemitism Movement around the world. He is based in Tel Aviv. He certainly would reject any idea that there is a genocide of any kind happening in Gaza. I mean, completely rejected. He says it's fake news. But he also believes that the work he's doing is is like an extension of the Israel military campaign. And he was, when he was the commander in the IDF, he was in charge of digital marketing, which of course is the exercise of sort of soft power, and we see how effectively, in fact, it is used by the IDF themselves, soldiers posting up videos and all that sort of thing. So that's where he's coming from. So when our articles were coming out, and in all we did, I think about 4 in Michael West Media before the summit even took place. And I might also mention that even before that, a journalist called Yaakov Aharon, who knows a huge amount about the Zionist lobby, more than I know, and I've worked with him. I've learned a lot from him on this topic. But then on top of the sort of messaging that was going out from the pro-Palestinian people about the summit, the big marches happened around Australia, and the march across the Harbour Bridge, and of course a huge march in other cities as well. And he then he first of all went to Jerusalem Post, which is the mainstream newspaper, English language in Tel Aviv, and then also posted another article on the Combat Antisemitism Movement website. And he attacked the people who were trying to delegitimize his summit as being anti-Semitic. Now,
300,000
really,
people.
at the end of it, I think, yeah, exactly, at the end of it, and this is a protest of hate. So they can say, look, they just put this stuff out there, and at the end of the day, I mean, first of all, 2 things I feel: we must not take our eyes off what is actually happening in Gaza. Overnight, children, babies have women have miscarried due to malnutrition, hospitals have been bombed. That is what is actually happening. And then we've got the sort of battle to tell the story and to convince people to take a stand on behalf of Palestine. And that's where all of what we're talking about comes in, because there's massive pushback to that. But at the end of the day, I've come to the conclusion, really, that anti-Semitism for people like Sasha Reutman, the head of CAM, I'll call it, the head of CAM, is really anything that is critical of Israel. At the end of the day, that's what it amounts to. They say, oh yes, according to the definition, you can criticize Israel. What they mean by that is sort of, you can, for example, say that you don't agree with Netanyahu's current political tactic. You think there should be a different political tactic. And you can maybe say that. But so long as you absolutely support the idea of Israel, and in fact Greater Israel, which is the program that they're always attempting to implement.
So Wendy, the timing here is quite interesting as well, because you have this massive public mobilization that peaked at that Sydney Harbour Bridge march. That was a very, very big mainstream moment in the public interest around the genocide, I think. And since then, the whole environment's been different. And this contrasts with these sort of small interest groups essentially screwing in very hard right now and trying to get their people out there to hit up these councils and organize these meetings and change the running gears of our country. So where does this clash, where do you see this clash ending up? I mean, we've got a large public interest in support of this genocide ending, behind wanting the government to do more than just recognize Palestine here. So, how does this conflict against this this push by this, it seems like a desperate push by the Zionist lobbies in Australia?
Look, I don't see it ending anytime soon at all. And in fact, I mean, it's interesting people use this word social cohesion. I'm not actually quite sure what they think that means, because of course there is conflict in society, and there's certainly conflict for people who are uh, like if you take the situation of, for example, families with roots in Palestine or Arabic background families who've in their own families have had people assassinated by the Israeli army over decades. I mean, they can't just suddenly, and the rest of us can't suddenly say, "Oh, we're not going to worry about the war in Gaza anymore. We're just going to stop trying to bring attention to it." And of course, we're not going to stop. And in fact, I think it's building. I don't think it is going to stop, but nor is the opposition going to stop. So the whole idea that we're going to have this social cohesion is ridiculous.
On that ridiculous thread, I mean, we've seen since the IRA definition was crammed down our throats by Siegel, the envoy, and how that kind of looked. I mean, there was that famous 7:30 interview, and since then, it seems the envoy has been, well, at least as far as the government's concerned, has been sort of packed away a little bit more, probably closer to the much less publicized Islamophobia envoy. I'm wondering if the same thing's going to be happening in response to some of these councillors who have been captured by the narrative, and if there's going to be pushback. I'm looking at Bayside and things like that. Can you see a little bit of a kickback, a public interest campaign that identifies that this has been imposed on residents that live in these areas, these local government areas?
I certainly can see a pushback, and what I think is there's always going to be in a struggle like this. There is always going to be pushback. There's always going to be up moments like as you said, the march across the Harbour Bridge and the other protests on that day were huge, and I don't think like that was a moment. Then it is go. But the other thing I think is important, Joel, is not only is there this pushback, um, but it's happening in almost every sphere of life. Every sphere of daily life. So it's happening in schools, for example. There's students who can't wear keffiyehs even on a national costume day. There's young doctors who are feeling silenced. It's happening in the universities, academics, proceedings taken against academics, journalists. But on the other hand, we saw Antoinette Lattouf, who a group of people got together behind the scenes and attempted to have her removed, did have her removed, but I think the damage well, when I say damage, just through fighting for her rights, she's had a big impact, I think, on the debate and understanding by taking it through the courts. That was, if you like, a high moment. So I think it's really hard to predict how it will go.
Let's not forget the concert pianists, the AFL football captains, the people that have sort of, and have been knocked back down as well. And some of them have been in instances or in scenarios where they're bound to contracts where they can't talk, or there's some legal issues where they've been silenced, or their careers as, captains of football teams or as promising young pianists are donked on the head by these executives that are trying to, kind of control the narrative. Yeah.
That's right, and we don't know how many people that's happened to who we've never heard of.
That's
We
exactly
can be
right.
sure many people have been silenced. On the other hand, you raised the Gillian Siegel, the release of her plan, and I think they expected it would be pretty smooth sailing. I think she'd done a lot of pre-planning. I think Albo they thought was where they wanted him to be. I think dumping Ed Husick, who is a Muslim background person from cabinet, added another factor that he was a little bit more outspoken, not very outspoken, but a bit more. And I think also that the reaction to the Gillian Siegel plan, the fact that Richard Flanagan, Louise Adler, and some other sort of pretty prominent people wrote strong columns against it again shifted. A lot of people know about the Gillian Segal plan from that wouldn't know, that probably don't read the non-mainstream media or don't follow it. So
It was worse than
yeah,
some of
I
the
can't
crap coming out of the
possibly.
US. It was Gillian's plan. She said it. It's my plan, my plan. And it was so kind of like a backwater Australia style. Like it was like half-assed. It was kind of like, yeah, as you said, the hubristic nature of this bloody thing, just to drop it on the table.
Look, I think the document itself is pretty scant and not an impressive document at all. But on the other hand, it is important. I think she's a person who's been subject to very little questioning in her life. I think you're right. She just thought she could drop this plan. And then, she just really froze when she was asked questions about it. She felt very under attack, and she sort of disappeared a bit since then. But interestingly enough, she did surface at the summit. I think she had to. And she was a keynote speaker there. And afterwards, she did do another press conference, and The Guardian were able to ask her, well, what have you got to say about the horrific, you know, uh, Nazi attack on Cape Sovereignty in Melbourne? What have you got to say about this movement? She didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to talk about it at all. She only wants to talk about what she sees as the anti-Semitism on the left, which is the anti-Israel stuff. Now, it's very interesting that she didn't want to talk about it, because I think people have to realise that there are strong links between the Zionist lobby. There has been some traditional alliances with Labor, and they remain there now, but the links with the right are getting stronger. And so I might just mention there that one of the partners in the summit was an organisation called Never Again Is Now.
Mhm.
Now, Never Again Is Now is a far right Christian nationalist organisation that line up with the evangelical ministries in the States, where they sort of believe that, there's a special role for Israel in the end of the world plan. And so they sort of promote that link very, very strongly. So I think that it was very awkward. I think it's very awkward if they can't condemn right-wing activity, Nazi-style activity in Australia. But I think
Or can't even
that's
feign,
that's
or
where they're
can't
going.
even feign concern for it. At the very least,
Yeah,
it's quite
and
striking.
but when you go back, yeah, when you go back to the federal election, and we haven't talked about the what I would call the astroturfing, the third-party organisations that sprung up that attacked the Teals and the Greens and called them terrorists, unreliable, dishonest, lacking in integrity, and all that sort of thing. That was their campaign. That group, there's various groups associated with that, and I won't go into all of that now, but if we just take one group, the Minority Impact Coalition in Queensland, that attacked the Greens Queensland MPs up there and tried to urge people, I think somewhat successfully, to put the Greens last. That group is actually a front for a group called the Jewish Queensland Collective. And that group was funded by Advance. That is on the record. That you can't dispute that. They actually did a forum where they acknowledged that. So those links are there. And then, of course, there was a lot of publicity on Stanley Roth and John Roth in Henroth Investments. John Roth is the husband of Gillian Segal. They have traditionally given hundreds of thousands to the Liberals over the years. They gave 50,000 to Advance. So there's no doubt that the right are solidifying, if you like. The links, I mean, they're both disintegrating at the parliamentary level, but also all these links are there behind the scenes.
Is by the association of some of these Zionist groups, it seems like they've damaged all the products they've been involved with. I mean, let's look at the Dutton campaign and like the absolute support for the Netanyahu style of Zionism coming out of his campaign, where to some extent, it felt like he was speaking more in portions of support for Israel than he was about policies for the election for Australia. Like he wasn't even talking domestically some weeks. And
Look, I
I
think
wonder
if
if the capitulation, in the vote there, is partly due to tethering his boat to that movement intensely. And I mean we're seeing it in other areas too. So yeah, I'm wondering now if there's been a bit of an infiltration of this Zionist money into like mainstream conservative and even sort of left movements like Labour, that's kind of damaged their brands by having them bend and bow and move around to kind of accommodate this very small interest that ultimately isn't compatible with the public interest.
I think it's interesting because I think it's a really good point you make that clearly the Dutton had a shocking campaign and collapsed, and we're seeing the aftermath of that continuing. And so clearly his pro-Netanyahu stance didn't, even more extreme than Labor, didn't do him any good. But on the other hand, I think that an analysis really needs to be done of the Better Australia, the Minority Impact Coalition and Advance, and all those groups. There was also a special one in Macmahon in Melbourne that was -1. What impact did that have on, I mean, I think the Liberal vote moved to Labor, but also what impact did that have on the Greens' preferences? And I've seen some analysis. Let's take, for example, the seat of Richmond, where Mandy Nolan stood a very good chance of winning that seat. Now, obviously, there's always many factors, and maybe they were never going to win. But how many? It's never actually been reported that Better Australia, who are Labor, Liberal, pro-Zionist organisation, were up there, including a man called Ophir Birnbaum, who's sort of well known because he sort of walked into the Cairo takeaway, and that sort of led to a whole lot of exposure of his activities. That they were putting out into every voter at pre-poll and on election day, they were putting a leaflet which says "Put the Greens last." If you look at the preferences, and I mean, we'd need to do every seat, but I have seen some that would indicate that while the primary vote held, the preferences didn't. So I guess rather than going into any more detail, I'd just say that that it may well be that it was damaging for Dutton, and people really, like for a lot of reasons, didn't like Dutton, some votes shifted to Labor. But at the same time, I don't think we would say they weren't effective at all in the election campaign. Certainly Zoe Daniel, the Teal, losing by 175 votes to what's her name, Tim Wilson. She was attacked in a really big way with a lot of money. I mean, we're yet to see where the money came from. Better Australia alone spent, I think, hundreds of thousands. I'm not sure how much, but on social media. So we're yet to really track the money, and we won't be, because of the electoral donation laws, we won't be able to do that, I think, for months yet, So anyway, I'm just saying, I think that picture is complex.
Totally. But that's sort of a bit of a case in point there, right? I mean, like Wilson's the one success, the one takeaway victory from that whole campaign for the coalition. And it's really a self-interest, the most self-interested campaign and self-interested candidate you could ever see. And I think the case in point there is that these, yes, Zionist groups, instead of helping the coalition more broadly, to give them the tools they need through some funding to maybe expand their reach or influence that's waning and rapidly dying in this new sort of landscape. It just concentrated on the couple of little bits and pieces that it wanted to concentrate at the expense of everything else. And essentially, yeah, it might have got a couple of candidates in. It might have really crushed a couple of people. Might have been a bit of enmity towards like Zoe Daniel. And yeah, look, I mean, I think it's really interesting. The one takeaway here is the stagnation. Like there was an effective campaign, potentially from the major parties and from these entities, that really took the sheen out of the Teals, the Independents, and the crossbench in this election. So much so that it feels like there's no kind of resistance front anymore in this massive Chifley like majority of Labor. And with the coalition sitting on its ass for the next one or two elections, what's been forecast, it's a little bit worrying what's been done. So there might have been some victories there in the routing of the independent voice, and maybe some parlaying that happened there.
I mean, this again is one of the, I think, gaps in the media that we're now facing. That takes us, I guess, a bit to the role of journalism and how to get information out there and sort of shift the narrative, because the narrative is what sort of gains momentum and power, and then how do you disrupt that narrative? And I don't want to downplay the strength of the movement or the pro-Palestinian part of it, because I think it has been hugely significant. I mean, every day in Sydney there's protests. Yesterday there was a couple of different ones on different issues. But at the same time we have the power of the right-wing media and a sort of bit of a gap.
I would like potentially now to move on to your article about the cardiologist who asked a question. This is a story, as you just mentioned earlier, where there's actual doctors and people, professionals out there that don't know about this story, and it is quite a public interest story, and one traditionally where we might have seen it in maybe one of the Fairfax papers or something like that. So yeah, could you give us a little bit of a breakdown of what happened here with St. Vincent's removal or sacking or whatever it was of Professor Peter Macdonald?
Well, it all began on a Saturday afternoon at the Addison Road Community Centre, where we had a panel that was actually about the Combat Antisemitism Movement. And a few of us planned this. It was run by the Palestinian Justice Movement. And we got to the end of the panel, and then there was a question time, and a person stood up. I didn't know him. He identified himself as a cardiologist, and he asked a question, and he basically said something like this, that during the week, the Albanese government had announced that it was the Iranian Revolutionary Guards that were responsible for two of the anti-Semitic attacks in Australia. People know about that they had said that, but up until then, he'd thought it was a no-brainer that it was Mossad, the external intelligence agency of Israel. What should he think now? Maybe Mossad had taken over Asia, but he said it in a sort of ironic, humorous tone. Now, I took it as an invitation to comment, and in fact, the panel then all commented in different ways. I just talked about my own view of intelligence agencies being involved in undercover operations, in my own experience, my own personal experience, often making mistakes, very inaccurate. And I think I mentioned the weapons of mass destruction. Others said other things. Now, that was the end of that. And then I heard that, in fact, a small group of doctors called the Alliance Against Anti-Semitism in Healthcare, now AAAHC, they are part of the network, the 5A's network, that people may have heard of, the Alliance Against Anti-Semitism in Academia. And so and again, I don't know even how many people are involved in these groups, but they're hardline Zionists. And what happened was three doctors had three of these doctors in the Alliance in Melbourne had written to St. Vincent's calling for Peter Macdonald to be suspended, terminated because of these hysterical conspiratorial views that he had mouthed at a fairly small public forum in Marrickville in Sydney. Now, we only knew about this because pretty quickly the right-wing Zionist media took it up. particularly the Daily Mail Australia, which is a sort of thing that just jumps on stories and beats them up, and then the Spectator Australia, which is edited by Rowan Dean, who's one of the Sky News commentators, and he really went to town in an editorial. He said, maybe no one would dare to go under the scalpel of this cardiologist. Now, I just need to fill you in on the cardiologist is Peter Macdonald. For those who know anything about heart transplants, he's one of the serious pioneers of heart transplants in Australia. He was one of the very few people. He was the main person who developed a thing called a heart in a box, which enables dead hearts to be kept pumping and put in live patients. He literally goes around saving lives, and many, many lives. And now he's developing a drug that will, from a funnel web spider, that will keep many people alive who have heart attacks and strokes. So he is like Victor Chang Institute, who is the research institute at St Vincent's, literally have used him this year to promote their work. You can find videos, interviews on radio. So he is a significant person. So this person,
this person should be on Australia Story talking about this right now.
Yeah, exactly. He's just to be the sort of person. If it hadn't happened for this on his retirement, he probably would have been on Australian Story. He's been on Radio National this year as one of the change makers in Australia, and interviewed, which Victor Chan Institute put up. Now, these fringe people, if you like, in Melbourne, fringe doctors, Zionist doctors, write this letter. Okay, they are entitled to their view. They can write a letter if they want to. But what is really shocking about what has happened is that St Vincent's and Victor Chan Institute have put out media statements now more than a week ago, which endorsed what they said. I mean, it didn't say they're going to terminate him now, but what they said is they basically labelled him a bigot, racist and anti-Semite on the basis of those comments that I described. It's just very shocking. Now, in terms of a story, he is not talking to the media. Now, we can speculate on why that might be. My own speculation would be that the hospitals told him not to.
Breach of contract, right?
Would be a breach of contract, yeah. So he's in, no doubt, a very difficult position. He has not been at St Vincent's now for 2.5 weeks. As far as I know, they haven't actually instituted proceedings against him. Like, in a workplace, you get a complaint and a process gets set up, and ideally, often these things happen in confidence, and you hope people get a chance to respond. But they have managed to, just by putting out these statements, and the Australian have run like 3 articles about this. And the head of the Executive Council of Australian Jury, Alex Rivkin, has written a personal, horrible letter to Peter Macdonald, which has been published in full in the Australian. So this is like something that anyone who's following the right-wing press would know all about. Everybody in the medical profession in the eastern suburbs would certainly know about it. St Vincent's is in the inner east. Major hospital, as people know, but also this is the whole of the St Vincent's network that put out this statement. So that includes St Vincent's in Melbourne, all of the aged care hospitals, the person who's in charge. Well, we don't know who put out the statement, and that is now what I'm pursuing, and hopefully we'll get another story out this week. I'm working on that with other people at the moment. Now, the statement from St Vincent's didn't have a name on it. Like, that's unusual. Like, normally when you get a statement, you get spokesperson or CEO. This has got nothing on it. So I naturally sent off questions to St Vincent's, like, who are we quoting here? Who's responsible for this statement? And other questions I asked. No answers. No, yes, they have responded in the sense that we're not answering any questions. So they put out these statements which are a denial of natural justice. Council for Civil Liberties in New South Wales has put out a statement saying this is absolutely at the heart of this is free speech. Like, this goes to the heart of, can healthcare workers make political comments at public forums, in this case without even mentioning the organisation they work for. So there's also obviously natural justice issues as well. So this is, I think, if they can take out these few doctors, if they can take out a senior heart transplant surgeon or physician in Australia, we can assume they have got a lot of power in that sphere anyway. Now, this organisation, the 3As, with also the ones who've stopped the seminar happening at the Children's Hospital, it's the same organisation. Well, when we say they've stopped it, the Children's Hospital is saying they're not denying that they received a letter from them. They're just saying they cancelled it anyway.
Yeah, that's right. I'd like to ask you a question about that in isolation, but we're at a point now where we've got this group, this AAA group, moving around. We don't really know how big it is or how many people are actually even in it. And all we know is that they have an executive at the hospital that essentially is in agree or cahoots with their message. And pretty quickly, we're seeing actions being taken here. So I'm wondering if these groups are really that consequential at all, apart from the fact that they're just sort of they're just looking for evidence that the executive is essentially looking for themselves to silence these doctors. Because it seems like by themselves, they shouldn't have that much power to be able to, act and push these, legends of the industry out of their job. Like, I can't help but think, there are kids. There was a report of children dying of cardiac arrest in Gaza, like massive levels, and now this doctor hasn't worked at a hospital for 2 weeks, saving lives. And the contrast is just insane. And look,
I know, and the contrast of harm is insane too, because what they're arguing is that at St Vincent's, doctors and nurses feel unsafe. And I mean, it's so absurd. Like, Peter Macdonald will be a person I've known, many of them, for many years. The Victor Chan Institute statement did come from the head of the Victor Chan Institute, who's Professor Kovacic. He has worked with Peter Macdonald for years. The whole idea that anyone is at risk, and this is just that people might feel uneasy knowing that someone didn't support Israel. It's completely absurd, and as you say, it needs to be contrasted with the actual harm done to people in war, and also the harm that's been done to the people who want to hold, like in the case of the Children's Hospital, want to hold the event. In the case of St Vincent's Network, all those doctors and nurses who are working there, who support the rights of the Palestinian people and do not want Peter Macdonald to be put out of his job. What about their interests? And just one more thing, Joel, I want to say about that is that the let's call them the 3As HC, the health worker one. They are part of the 5As, the academic one, but they're also holding events with the Australasian Jewish Medical Federation. That's quite a powerful organisation.
How many groups do these guys have in the medical industry?
Well, I could tell you from now researching it a bit, I can tell you that the links between the medical profession in Australia and Israel are very extensive. And this is an instance just like with the academic institutions where the links are strong. And I mean, the healthcare industry in Israel is advanced technically, and there is a memorandum of understanding between one of the biggest hospitals, the Sheba Hospital, and the New South Wales government. So, we're just beginning I guess, to discover. And all of this is hiding in plain sight. It doesn't take a lot to discover it, but you have to ask questions and look. And so I think yes, maybe the activists are a small group and are very busy, but they have very strong links with a much broader group of Zionist doctors.
And they've got these silent supporters everywhere that are offering their support. Now we can move on to this children's hospital event, because I think this is where it kind of hits rock bottom for a lot of people. And potentially, I think the story and the public interest, if we can get it out there, is one that can really start maybe opening up some discussions. Australians trust their doctors. They trust their pediatric doctors. We live in a country where, they're highly regarded in our society. Everyone, from the left and the right, somewhat diminishing post-COVID, but there is a general national respect for everything these people do. Our healthcare system is highly valued by our society, and it's one of the differences that we're proud of, that separates us from other countries that we like to be critical of. And seeing that this Children of War, essentially this is a event called Children of War. There were 4 keynote speakers. One of them, an Australian nurse who had served in Gaza, and some other experts that were, it was set up to essentially, not even saying the word Gaza, not even saying the word genocide, not saying anything like that, but it was showcasing the repercussions, the effects, and the issues of children in war. And this seminar was kind of cancelled at the 11th hour. And I'm wondering if you could potentially give us a little bit of information about that.
Well, I'm not completely on top of what happened at the Children's Hospital, but it did happen, I think, the day before. And a lot of work would have gone into putting that forum together, or putting that grand rounds, I think they're called. And in this case, we've got Médecins Sans Frontières, an organisation that works in war zones all over the world that is very highly respected. We had another organisation that's actually got a Nobel Prize for its work. And the very fact that some pressure from a few people caused the CEO to cancel it, I think, is a real shock. Now, in this case, The Guardian has reported that a Sydney doctor, and it's sort of odd that we've got the Melbourne doctors writing to New South Wales and the Sydney doctor writing to Melbourne, Dr. Doran
Psychiatrist too,
Samuel.
right?
Psychiatrist, yeah,
Yep.
he's actually. I'm just working on an article at the moment that will deal a bit more with him, but I might just mention that Doran Samuel was involved in the astroturfing campaign, it's the Better Australia campaign I was talking about. I mean, one of the things I think about these people is you really need to look at the interlocking organisations and the number of different activities they had. So anyway, he's a known quantity. He's a right-wing liberal who was screaming in the electorate of Reed.
Wendy,
The Sydney Morning
just
Herald
one thing.
reported.
They were complaining about, Peter Macdonald working on people's hearts. But what about this bloke working on people's brains? You know that there's no discussion about that. But anyway, we'll continue.
Well, let me just say, Joel, that he has been working on people's brains on behalf of the insurance companies for
Great.
many, many years. He's appeared in many, many court cases against people who are making claims. He does reports. He doesn't, tends not to find. I won't go further into that except just to say, like,
it's an
everybody
interesting
has a
one.
history, and he's got a history. And I'm working on that right now. People might have a look in Michael West in a few days. But anyway, yes, I mean, why do these people think? Like, this is again where I come back to my point. Look, I don't have, of course, I'm opposed, but I can accept that Dr. Doran Samuel does not agree with me politically, that he may want to make public statements. We can all, accept that. But to go out of your way to get some other people who you don't even know, to get them silenced. It's just not acceptable, and we just have to push back on that, because it's just a massive McCarthyist style impact that really will frighten people. Like those people at the Children's Hospital, I didn't know them, but the people who organized that seminar, that event, what would they be feeling? Like, here they are, they're actually pediatricians or they're nurses or whatever they are, and their work is so disrespected. Like, where's that going to leave them feeling? And
It's
yet this
devastating.
person
It's
is, now we
devastating.
don't know it, yeah, but his letter was probably, like, I think these things are triggered. And then, like, he wrote a letter. The Guardian certainly reported as a significant letter in the event. The Children's Hospital are now trying to push back and say, oh no, it was people inside the hospital. But how many? What did they say? Why couldn't they have just been told, well, don't attend? Like, this is what you would expect to happen in a university, for example. You may not like the fact that someone's going to have a public meeting calling for sanctions on Israel. Don't attend. Like, it's not a problem if you get to feel a little bit uncomfortable about things. So that's the situation at the Children's Hospital. I think they're now organising another event at Melbourne University, but it's not good enough. It's not the same. And the medical organisation for the prevention of war. I don't think I've quite got that name right, but they have put out a very strong statement. Medicine Sans Frontier, very unhappy as well. The big question that I think we have to ask is, what role are the donors playing, the big donors playing in all of this? And that's what we're
Well,
having a look at.
the Murdoch family is very, very heavily linked to the Children's Hospital as well. And yes, it's impressive to see all these wheels turning for this disproportionate group that somehow gets to change like the resting state of what that hospital is all
Yeah,
about. I mean, this conference is something about children suffering in war, and this is the Royal Children's Hospital. One of the preeminent children's hospitals on the planet. It's got an international reputation as a world leading hospital, and the pediatricians there are denied access to something that means it's so important to them.
people need to call for an inquiry into these things. Like, what is it like? These are big public hospitals. What is the government doing to allow this to happen? And I
For
mean, there
sure.
really needs to be questions asked in Parliament, questions asked to ministers. What is going on? And it's not good enough that the CEO of the Royal Children's Hospital should bat it away and say we're going to fix it all up. What really, we need to see the emails we receive. We need to see him actually out in the open saying what happened, because what we're seeing here is the exercise of hidden power. As you say, these people seem on the face of it to be quite not hugely significant. So why are they able to exercise so much power? That we've got to get an answer to that question.
That disproportionality that we've seen everywhere,
Yeah,
including around the Dural caravan attack, including around every single issue that's pervaded our society over the last couple of years. And it's no coincidence. We are in a different landscape completely post October 7, regarding social cohesion and regarding like the health of our bureaucracies and our hospitals, our universities. Everything's at siege, and we're getting to see an element that was maybe concealed in our society working at 110% to push its objectives upon Australian society. And they're very organized and they're internationally coordinated, and we're seeing the damage of something like that and how it can be inflicted. So look, I think this really speaks to a public interest. This is a huge public interest topic here. Hospitals under siege, pediatric doctors silenced, and public interest journalism is such an important part of revealing that. there's been an abrogation in the mainstream press where, essentially some of these stories are kind of left to the wayside, and the mainstream public can't sit with these topics and develop them and push them forward and pressure government to essentially address them. So you've worked on, exposés. You've had like what, 4 or 5 decades an incredible
I have to say
career.
it's five. I've been a journalist for 5.5 decades.
5.5 decades, and I
It's
and
an
I
awfully
imagine
long time.
I imagine you're planning on getting to six, and just yeah, to have a crack and beyond. So
I
look,
was a student journalist in the beginning.
but you've worked on big exposés, huge public interest stories, and your recent work with Michael West, and even on your own platform, it, really presses towards that space. So I just want to get from the horse's mouth here. What do you define as public interest journalism in the context of your investigations, yeah, over the years?
Look, I think public interest journalism is where, I mean, in a sense, it's where the impact is really about people, um, power. I'll say what I don't think public interest journalism is, because it's a very broad idea, public interest, and is often quite difficult to define, but it's not journalism that is driven by money. It's not journalism. I mean, in fact, of course, everyone wants an audience, but it's not journalism that's driven by how can we get the most clicks, or how more likely how can we get the most advertising. Um, and it's also journalism that is prepared to resist powers to suppress, which will always be there. There'll always be pressure to keep things hidden. So I think public interest journalism resists those constraints and tries to bring information out anyway. Now, of course, it can be like there's just so many examples. Anything to do with environmental damage is obviously public interest journalism. Anything to do with public health, on the health of people, or abuse of power is obviously public interest journalism. Some of the earliest things that I worked on when I was a student, and this is 5.5 decades ago, but at that stage, prisoners in Grafton Prison in New South Wales, but also terrible abuses in Pentridge Prison then. They'd gone on for decades. Like at Grafton Prison, people have been bashed every single day as a routine measure. For 30 years, that had been happening. It had never been in the media. The Sydney Morning Herald, I remember going back then that, a nun had even tried to contact the Sydney Morning Herald. No interest in police abuse. So, like, this is not a new phenomenon. Now, even when, like, later on, I worked in the mainstream
Sorry,
media
Wendy.
for quite.
Just to ask you, like, but does a public interest like sow the seed of the story? Is that what it's about? Like, because I mean, yeah, New South Wales police corruption, for example, no one wanted to know about it in the early days for yourself, but eventually they did. Eventually, things kind of
Yes.
started changing. So, yeah, how does that kind of work?
So you have to bring things into the open. If no one knows about them, no one's going to do anything about them. And journalism like that does have an impact. In the end, for example, in relation to prisons, just that one strand in New South Wales, it was the student press and the like, independent actors, lawyers who back then just published the information. You have to take that step of publishing it, even if the mainstream isn't on board. But eventually, of course, through activism and through protest, it became a bigger story. In the end, in the case of prisons, a whole prison was burnt down, and that led to the establishment of a royal commission. A similar story you could tell in relation to Indigenous deaths in custody. Like, it's a combination of bring it into the open and then other people, not media, but you're reporting on, agitating forward, trying to get more attention, trying to get change. Of course, often in the aftermath of those big institutional, let's take the Royal Commission into Indigenous deaths in custody, that we saw peak reporting when that report came out now over 30 years ago, peak reporting, national shame. We're going to do something about this. Sadly, often the media drops away at that point, and there's very little coverage then as the implementation phase goes into practice. So I'm not trying to paint this in any way as a simple continuum of improvement, because it's not. But I think also, if you're a public interest journalist, you want to expose things that are hidden. You want people to know about them. Now, some people would argue that, information is not as, like, it's the narrative that counts, it's the story it counts, the messaging. But I have to say, I still really do believe that, for example, take the stories we've been talking about, there is someone who actually, and activists and journalists can work together here, but unless someone is actually tracking what is happening to all these council motions and how, is democracy being denied? Are people allowed to speak up? All those little things that do take time to track, unless you've got some people doing that work, it all gets very thin in terms of moving a story forward or moving the situation forward.
I think that's good advice
Does
for
that make some sense? I
it.
hope so.
It definitely does. I mean, there's a little bit of advice in there too for aspiring public interest journalists that are looking to sort of enter that space. And look, I want to ask you too. I mean, you've been around, nearly 6 decades now. You've seen, yeah, like we mentioned, the 1980s New South Wales police force, for example. You've seen, corruption on a grand scale, federally and on a state level, even locally. But right now we're kind of, in the post opaque ICAC world, under Albanese after 10 years of a coalition with secret portfolios. It feels like maybe the golden age of integrity that we had in our society is kind of on a slip a little bit, and there has been, a large public interest in corruption and in issues like that. How do you see the current political landscape now? And I'm talking about preserving these Zionist narratives about, the large multinational resource sector that has so much power over proceedings. And also Washington and the way that they've been able to push us around in ways that, we haven't quite, I don't think, seen before. How do you sort of see influence with regards to other decades, and how bad is it compared to other decades?
Look, I think that's a huge question. I do think neoliberalism, which really began in the 1980s, so we've now seen 4 decades of neoliberalism, and I think that is not only disconnecting public services from accountability, but it's also a mindset, I think, in the conditions of employment that mean that everybody's like a little individual out there trying to bargain, for the next job or the next contract. And I think that has been enormously damaging to our society. I'm not one, however, to
Yeah, here.
want to idealize the past. However, I have to realize that my adult children are living in a far, far less secure employment world than my generation did. Like, I was an activist and in the end I was an academic, and paid by the public for 20 years. I've had a very easy go in that way, and that's no longer there for people. However, I just want to say that there is a certain tendency, particularly with the media, to idealize the past. And that's why I use that example of how much was hidden. When I was growing up, it didn't occur to me to want to read, the mainstream media. We're just keen to get alternative newspapers from the States, or do our own media, so, and then when I was at the National Times, and for those who don't know, that was a weekly, so long ago now, but a weekly investigative newspaper put out by what's now Nine Media. Now, when I was there, that was edited by a veteran journalist now, Brian Toohey, who was a very independent journalist and did a lot of stories on security and defence. Look, there was rows all the time. there was suppression then. A huge story then was the story about the or now dead ex-Prime Minister Bob Hawke. Now some people might idealize Bob Hawke, but at the time, the story, and it's so relevant today. This was when the Zionist lobby was building up. After 1975, there was a feeling that the Labour Party were turning away from Israel, and a big effort was made to bring the Labour Party within Zionist influence. And that's where people like Sir Peter Abels, who was, a major corporate person in TNT and transport, and he formed a very close friendship with Bob Hawke, and we covered in the National Times a lot of things, connections back then with organised crime and all of that. Now, we used to bring out stories like in the National Times, come out on a Thursday, and you think, oh, this is a really big story, it'd be on the cover, and then it'd be silence in the rest of the media, like it wasn't happening. Now, back then, we were a smaller society, first of all, and most people probably did grab a copy of the National Times or talk about it at least, and it was promoted a bit through the ABC as well. But nevertheless, I just want to say that the concentration in the media was a huge problem then and became an even bigger problem by the end of the 80s. And in some ways now, I think we've got a more open situation with things like what you're doing now or what Michael West is doing. Now, Michael West was a business editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. Like, he was very mainstream, but he couldn't really do what he wanted to do there. So he left, and now he's doing something that's really highlights accountability. Is not it's probably a bit different than some of the other independent media. And then you've got
He's the embodiment of public interest journalism in Australia now.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael really puts a lot of store by covering accountability issues, which maybe might be a little bit heavy for some people, but are really important. FOI, for example, I mean, right now, the Labor government is moving to restrict our rights to information. Now, if you want public interest journalism, that is a huge step backwards. So someone like Rex Patrick
I was about to say, this is purely designed to quell Rex Patrick at the moment.
I know, I think so, because, if anyone, I mean, freedom of information can be very time consuming and tedious, but he's become a champion on that. And then you've got these other sort of citizen journalists, like some of them use false names like Ronnie Salt and Jommy T, and, who are big on X. And they're really good researchers too. So I feel that the media has opened up. The thing is, how do we build our audiences and connect with more people?
That's the challenge we're all looking at. I've spoken with Michael about this and a few others, even like Eddie Djokovic the other week. Essentially, we need to start like an IGA. There's this Coles and Woolworth duopolies everywhere, and we kind of need to get all our little independents, somehow, talking to each other. Maybe we could do it on the blockchain or something like that. I'm just throwing out some stupid ideas. But look, while I've got you,
I agree very much. We need to build some at least sense of cooperation. I think that is happening. Like, you've got the shot, something like the shot, which is putting out a lot of analysis. Now, I hadn't even until recently really sort of been across that. Because if you're doing journalism, it tends to be a bit time consuming, so you don't have a lot of time to sort of organise. But I do think something needs to build, but then we need to tackle the issue of how to extend the reach. How, for example, to go into the western suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne, for that matter, and other places around Australia, of course, and into regional areas, because that's where the right will tend to grow. And if you don't have any, like if you take, for example, I have done stories about a big landfill in Western Sydney where a lot of residents were being seriously impacted. No journalism. Unless you have some media outlets that are interested in bringing that out for local audiences, people really don't have any information. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of issues to tackle.
There are a lot of young journalists out there, some of them struggling at legacy media outlets, good people that want to learn about the tradecraft, want to be better journalists, but then also people on the outside that are looking towards public interest journalism as something that's really important, and we're trying to promote that. What advice can you offer to these people? Firstly, the people languishing within restrictive environments in the legacy media, but also people sort of out on their own, sometimes having a pretty bad day trying to push things forward.
Look, I think for the people inside the mainstream, look, if you're going to go into the mainstream as a progressive person, you're always going to be working within constraints. I'll just give you a little example of that. Like when I was at Nine Media, or Fairfax, we called it then, I mean, I had a general view of corruption. I knew there were structural factors, but in practice, in terms of journalism, you tend to be pushed towards the individual story. I could see the limitations, but I'd made a decision that I was going to work in that situation. Ultimately, I stopped working in the mainstream because it stopped me. You can try to push the limits, and there is value in being, I think, inside the mainstream. I'm not a person who would say to someone, I don't think you should be working there. I guess because I was in journalism education, I knew that people who wanted jobs, a lot of them would end up in organisations, and some people do walk out. And there have been people leaving the ABC, very good young journalists, even in recent times. So they're the people inside the mainstream. Um, for other people, I really think that, first of all, in the end of the day, I mean, I think you can't be a good journalist unless you've got an analysis. But a lot of people actually they can have a very strong analysis. And once you've got that, you just need, in a sense, some workshopping to build up the skills and what are the methodologies of journalism. How do we verify things? And that's something that can be done. You don't need to be in a university to do that. And I would like to see the possibility, and I'm thinking about this, of doing, like way back in the 70s, we had a thing called the Free University. I don't ultimately think that public interest journalism can all be done for money. Now, look, that's, I know for some people, controversial, because everybody deserves a decent job and a decent wage for doing it. And I believe you're a member of the union and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, as a retired person, I can, I choose to contribute my labour. But that is a tricky decision, particularly for younger people. Obviously, they can't do that. However, I know people right now, like I know a person who's actually in the health professions, who in the evenings is doing investigative journalism. So there's different solutions for different people. And I think when you get to the point, like people can just have their own sites or contribute to other sites. There is a point when people should ask for money. Like if you're doing, say, articles for The Guardian, which is a major global media, of course they should be paying decent rates. But I also think there is room for this idea of journalism as community service, as a vocation, if you like,
Totally.
and as working in, and I think that's become uh, much more in tune with where people are moving at the moment.
Yeah, I
Because
tend to
quite
agree.
frankly, if we leave it to the right wing media, just get more propaganda.
Totally. And I think people are taking matters into their own hands a lot more based upon that. I mean, personally, I've been in this game now for 4 years. Before then, I hadn't written an article. And if it wasn't for beefing with Peter Van Onselen over just how crap journalism was during the pandemic, I wouldn't be here today. I would drag myself kicking and screaming into the writing that I do, and yeah, I haven't sort of looked back. And it's sort of funny how those sliding doors moments and things like that kind of happen to people when they're put into a position, when they're denied objective facts in a democracy that they want to be a part of, just like me, just like anyone. it's an actuating moment that happens. And I think the legacy
I
media,
think that's really true.
yeah, the
Yeah,
legacy media
I really agree with
better
that,
watch
Joel.
out. Yeah, definitely, the legacy media better watch out
Yeah.
because if it keeps pushing these narratives down a certain pathway, it's going to unlock the tall poppy syndrome of this country is going to stand up, and we're going to start chopping these guys out and start developing our own kind of ways of going about things. So yeah, there's that.
I hope so. And I might just say that that is, in fact, like if you go back to the journalists of the Vietnam War era, that's where a lot of them were coming from too. Like, what we want to get the truth out, like, and that's itself a very motivating thing. And I think it's really good what you're doing. Another one is Nick Hanna, who's a criminal lawyer who's doing
Excellent.
podcasts
Yeah.
and you know it doesn't take like journalism is really just about certain methodologies to ensure accuracy and bring aiming for the truth, aiming to bring the truth out. That's really what it is. It doesn't need to be done by people who just call themselves professional journalists. It could be done by a doctor or by a person, a horticulturist, or a person, a road worker. It can be done by anybody.
Look, it's just been a pleasure to have you on, Wendy. You're someone who I admire a lot personally in the industry. And, you know, people like you are a real shining light, I think, for those trying to sort of get out of this modern legacy matrix that is the media in this country, the third most concentrated in the world behind Egypt and China. So, yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much.